Hi, I'm Peter Boyles. I do the morning show, really next door on 710 KNUS. And we've begun the series called The Shoot. And it's been absolutely wonderful. Last week we did Mafia Hitmen. We had those two fellows on, former members of the Mafia. They're in Florida now. And we started talking about people that we had met before. And I love reading and I love doing books. And so we were talking about a book called Marine Raiders, the story of the legendary World War II battalions. And welcome into our shoot is Carole Engle Avriett. She's incredible. I love her dearly. We've never actually seen one another, but we've talked on the phone. Hey, Carole, thank you for doing the shoot, and thank you very much again for all of your work.
Good morning, Pete. It's great to be with you this morning.
You too. We were talking to one another just down the line here before we began to roll on the tape about people, sometimes historians say the world, the flesh, and the devil, about our world today. And I'm an old guy, and I grew up with these legendary men and women around me all of my life. In my formative years, World War II uncles and guys I worked in a steel mill with. And it dawned on me recently, our nation then and our nation today. We started to talk about this, and I turn it over to you as a historian to set the stage and talk about today versus what you write about.
Well, that's a big subject there, and one that I think all historians do thinking about. So much of what our country was about during that time, 30s and 40s, they had been through so much. The Depression, all of that, and then World War I leading up to the events in the late 30s, and then, of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And the country itself simply rallied around the mission of the country. There was no one really that was unequivocal about it. In fact, we all know stories or have heard stories of even in small towns, the one or two young men that were classified as 4F and could not go in to the army or the military, could not join up. Many of them took their own lives. They were
lived in shame. That's right.
They were devastated that they could not fight for their country. Now, that in and of itself, just that little bit of information shows you some of the difference of commitment and the love for the country. You know, one of the young men told me, well, he was in his 90s when I spoke to him, but he was speaking of when he was a young man. When he heard it, he was coming out of church and about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And he immediately, without any question or thought, jumped into his car, raced to San Francisco. He was living outside of Sacramento. By the time that afternoon, on that Sunday afternoon, December 7th, 1941, there were already thousands of young men lined up, circling serpentine line, all the way up and down the streets just to get into the recruit depot to sign up. You know, I was talking not long ago about someone talking about how their parents told them, those of us that had parents that were alive during that time, how they learned of the start of that war in 1941. And of course, most people learned it over the radio, but many, many people, my mother included, were in church when they heard it. Now, see, that says something right there. Mother told me the story. She was in a little church in the Deep South, and the minister was just preaching away, and he was long-winded. And all of a sudden, everybody got real still and quiet because they noticed that an usher had brought him a little note, and it touched his elbow. And the preacher opened that note, read it, got very, very somber, took his big Bible and closed it, and he simply said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Pearl Harbor has been bombed." And that was, you know, people filed out of church and began doing My mother, in fact, rolled bandages every weekend with the Red
Yeah.
Cross.
Yeah.
They're all the young men were gone.
Yeah.
They had gone off to war.
You know,
But
I've read
everyone played a part. Everyone played a part in all
I've
of that.
read great historians who say a lot of American people didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, but the fact the country had been attacked.
Yes,
That
exactly. Exactly.
they were stories about being in luncheonettes or at sporting events. The Redskins apparently were playing football on that Sunday, and it was announced, and people looking at one another. But and some people thought it was another Wells stunt, another radio stunt, which of course it wasn't. But they, the fact that the country had been attacked, it's all it took, and it was
Right.
on. Yeah.
Right.
And we know now about, the victory gardens and the scrap drives and the gasoline rationing and the rubber rationing. And I've read numbers of people suggest that that may not have had to have happened, but FDR was so smart because then he brings you into the war. Then you too are now part of this, growing tomatoes and vegetables and finding scrap and doing the scrap drives and the bonds, the war bonds, all these things. It was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant, and it encompassed, although apparently it didn't have to, but it encompassed the country. I agree with you. I mean, I don't know where the train went off the tracks, but boy, it sure is off the tracks now.
Seems that way. The four young men that I feature in this book that we're talking about today, Marine Raiders, all four of them had a very similar response. And it's interesting to look at their different backgrounds. They were completely different, four completely different young men, and yet their response was very, very similar from one to the other, and it was immediate.
Yes.
And it's really incredibly. Here is Lee Manier, and he joined up within 2 weeks.
How old was he? Carol, how old was he when Lee joined? How old was he?
Lee was 24. He was the oldest of the
He's
four.
old. Yeah.
That I write about. Yes. The average age of the young men fighting in World War II were from 18 to 24. Now, obviously, there were some that were, older, and there were some that were younger. One of the men that I write about signed up. He was 17 years old. You had to get a parent to sign for you. So I have the scene where he went and begged his father, who at that time was the police chief for Gila County, Arizona. And he had to go and beg his father to sign for him, and his father finally gave permission. So, but it was not uncommon for even 16-year-olds. There were quite a few
younger than that. Yeah.
Yes.
Chuck Yeager. They found how old Chuck Yeager was the first time, and I think Chuck Yeager might have been, 15 years old, they lied to get in.
They just went in, and of course, I'm certain that a lot of these senior sergeants probably suspected that some of these were not of the right age, but it was the enthusiasm of wanting to go and do something for your country, to defend it, and it was a feeling and a sentiment and a belief that was so widespread. It was a coming together of everyone, really.
And the other part of that, I love this woman. Carole's with us, the story of the legendary World War II Battalions, Marine Raiders. You get the book through us and the Peter Boyles Book Club. But the duration of your term of service, it wasn't 24 months or 36 months. They would say it is the duration of the war plus 6 months. So guys that went, especially the Raiders and others, they wouldn't come home for years. They were gone.
Yeah. Yes, and another little part of this that's an interesting side issue. In my talking with people and friends and others, acquaintances and all, and when I began studying for Marine Raiders, I found that most people, the general reading public, and myself included, I'm going to add myself to this group, really know more about the war in Europe than we do in World War II, the war in Europe, than we do the war in the Pacific.
That's
And
true.
yet, the war in the Pacific began 2 years prior to the invasion of Normandy. Now, granted, we were already had already been in North Africa and Sicily and in Italy. My own father was participated in all that. But the invasion, which really was the huge event, was 2 years after our fellows in the South Pacific had been fighting ferocious battles for 2 years. Not only that, but the VE Day, the war ended in Europe, victory in Europe, months before the war ended in the Pacific. So really, we had thousands and thousands of young men fighting in the Pacific for a long time, prior to and after the actual main events in Europe. So
And
it's interesting that we would know, that most people know more about Europe, but there's some reasons for that, I think, and I've spoken to some other people about this. I think one of the things is that so many of these young men were first generation with parents who had migrated or immigrated here from Europe. Italian families and Scandinavian families and all sorts of European families. So they had great ties in Europe. The other thing is that when was the last time you heard someone say, "Oh, I just can't wait for my vacation this summer. I'm going to take my family for 2 weeks to Guadalcanal."
never.
You're talking about going to
No.
Paris or
No. Yeah.
Rome or somewhere.
Yeah.
But so it's a part of the war of World War II that really we need to do some thinking about and some focusing on, and that is one of the reasons I was so honored and privileged.
You're wonderful. And we know now that FDR, George Marshall, they focused on defeating the Nazis first. That was their policy. Europe first, and then we will go and we will defeat the Japanese. And as a great reader that you are, the United States of America beat the Japanese. We defeated the empire. The Soviets most likely took the blunt of the Second World War, but remember, there are English speakers in England. There is a great connection. You got Murrow, you got all these different characters that fed, it was a different media, but fed the media. And Roosevelt's an Anglophile, and the Japanese, they don't think can do the damage, but of course they could. And no, it's the politics of war is what it's called. And no, you're absolutely right. And when those guys went, so how long did most of those young men go before they actually came home again?
Well, actually, the engagements with the Raiders and the Marine regiments, the regular line Marine regiments, that fighting, which began D-Day for the South Pacific, was August 7th, 1942. See, that is 2 years before the invasion of D-Day in Normandy. And ferocious battles. I cover some of those in the book, and so there were a lot of casualties, wounded as well as killed in action. And then, of course, the Marine Raiders were disbanded after about 20 months and folded into regular line Marine regiments. And there are reasons for that. The war in the Pacific required thousands and thousands of men to invade those islands. The Japanese were a different kind of warrior from the Germans.
The theory was after Normandy, when the SS murdered those young American soldiers in the snow. And I've read this, I certainly don't know it, but I've read it. After that, there were no prisoners. After Normandy, no one took prisoners. No one took prisoners the other way because they knew there was no surrender. They weren't going to surrender, and if you surrendered, you were dead anyhow.
Yes.
I think that
I
plays
think
on.
I
Yeah.
think another reason that the war in the Pacific was it, all right.
Say it.
War anywhere is horrible.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
as you well know. So you're really, but in the Pacific, our men learned that they were fighting not just a two-legged
Yeah.
enemy, but the jungle itself. And jungle warfare, and I didn't know much about it until I did my research for this book. It's really horrific. It took such a toll on the bodies, the mentality. These men that came back from the Pacific, many of them fought lingering
Oh,
illnesses and
malarias and
yeah,
yeah,
malaria
black
and
water.
different
Yeah.
things. Yes,
Yeah.
for
No.
years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I when I read this stuff, and as a boy, I'm listening, and um, I worked in a steel mill with a guy that had been part of this. Never talked. I think was quite alcoholic. Remarkable guy, but the guy that always turns up is there's Carlson. It's Evans, I think Evans Carlson.
Evans.
Carlson's
Yes.
Raiders. Talk about Evans Carlson. And because he
Yes.
actually, from my reading, they were chasing Pancho Villa, these guys. I mean,
Oh
they.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Please
yes.
talk about that. Yeah.
These leaders that were tapped to lead these four Marine battalions, Marine Raider battalions at the beginning of the war, were incredibly interesting, charismatic
Oh.
men. The first one of First Raiders was a man by the name of Merritt Edson, and then tapped to lead Second Raider Battalion was Evans Carlson, the gentleman that you just named. Now, interestingly, both Edson and Carlson had been in the Marine Corps for quite a while.
Had they gone to
And
Nicaragua? They'd done all of that as well, did they
yes,
not?
they'd been in
Yeah.
Nicaragua, and in fact, both of them had been stationed in China. Now, that to me was one of the most interesting connections.
Chinese
because-
Marines. Yes.
Yes, because toward the end of in the 30s, late 30s, the Chinese were battling the Japanese. And as a result of Edson and Carlson being in China, they learned what some of these Japanese tactics were. They learned the kind of fierce warriors that the Japanese were. And so when they were tapped to lead our Marine Raider battalions, they were able then to teach these young men some of what they had learned in China. Now,
How
as
old
far as Evans Carlson-
was Carlson when he gets the Raiders? Because I know he'd been in Nicaragua and with the not the Sandistas, but Sandino. They'd chased Villa. I know they were Chinese Marines. So he wasn't a kid.
He was early 40s.
Okay.
But see, the thing is, he had run away from home permanently when he was 14 years old and joined the Marines. He was one that lied about his age, but evidently he had a lot of moxie. And he joined the Marines when he was 16 years old. He was in Corregidor while he was 16, establishing the gun emplacements in Corregidor in the Philippines.
Wow.
So he already knew the South China Seas. He knew that area. And one of the most interesting things, Carlson seemed to have the knack for meeting and getting to know very, very famous people. When he was in China, he actually met and became friends with Mao Zedong.
I've read some of those stories. Yeah.
And Mao actually hooked him up with his main general, and Carlson went on part of the 1,000-mile march with the Chinese route army.
It's the Long March, and I've read Edgar Snow, and I read all those books, and I know that Carlson. I knew he knew them. Where'd they pick up gung ho? Did they pick up gung ho there?
Yes, and a lot of people don't realize, a lot of people use that term gung ho, have no idea what the history is. But Carlson was really the one that introduced that phrase into the English language.
I've read that. Yeah.
Gung means work.
Work together.
And ho means harmony.
Yeah,
So put them together, and it's called work in harmony. And that was
work together or work and but
thing,
he knew. I think he knew like Chou and Lai, and we were talking about Lin Piao the other morning with a woman. Here's this remarkable guy. I think was he a captain then when he meets all these people? And
he was a captain, and then of course he had this incredible friendship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt
and Jimmy.
he had been in the security guard at White Springs, Georgia. And as a result of being a part of the security guard there, of course, he got to know Roosevelt, got to know his wife very well, Eleanor, and also then his son. That was how
Jimmy.
Jimmy Roosevelt became so well known to Carlson.
Yeah.
And so when Carlson was tapped to be the leader of Second Rated Battalion, he said, "Well, I want my XO to be Jimmy Roosevelt." Well, you know, there you've got what kind of connection better than that?
No, I actually have a dear friend. I'm in recovery. I don't secret that, but I have a friend who's I'm in recovery with, whose uncle was a tragic alcoholic, but served under Jimmy Roosevelt and went through.
Is that right? Wow.
Terrible times. I actually knew him. I mean, when I was a young guy, I knew him. And his out card when he was drinking was no matter whatever happened, he could call Roosevelt. I'm going to call Jimmy Roosevelt, which I look back and said he probably would have called him, and Jimmy Roosevelt probably would have done something for him because of the bond that those men had. But he served under Jimmy Roosevelt and talked about it.
Wow. Isn't that something?
No.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
No.
Yeah.
And what ultimately happens? I mean, when there's, I think there's 4 battalions, correct? Do I remember that correct?
Correct.
4 Raider battalions. So what happens? What happens? Yeah. What happens to these men?
Okay. They were involved in about a dozen incredibly ferocious engagements in Guadalcanal, and then on up to New Georgia, and then Bougainville. Mm-hmm. And by the end of 1943 was when the Raiders were disbanded and folded into these larger regular line Marine divisions. But during that time, the Raiders actually were awarded the highest percentage of Valor Awards, Medal of Honor Awards, Navy Cross, Silver Stars, to their percentage of the total number of Marines that were in the South Pacific. It is quite amazing, and I have those stats and those numbers related in the book, recorded in the book, so you can just see for the number of men that were actually Raiders. The number of Valor Awards that they were awarded were just phenomenal, and also the number of ships that were named after various Raiders. Later gives you some idea of the kind of warriors that they were and how well thought of they were.
One of the questions that historians ask, do men make the times or do times make the men? And in this moment that you capture so well, giants walk the earth, good and bad, winners and losers, but giants walk the earth. And one of the guys I was thinking, because I know I was going to talk to you, somebody I'm always drawn to is Holland Smith, who they called Howlin' Mad.
Yes.
And
Howling Mad.
Howlin' Mad Smith. A not known person, but he's a giant who's walking the earth. Talk about General Smith.
Yes. Well, General Smith was not the only one, Pete. There were so many others. Let me just throw out one that was a Marine Raider, Liver's Edge, who was tapped to be the leader of 3rd Raider Battalion. Mm-hmm. And later on, he was then, of course, the general that led the men in the invasion of Iwo. Mm-hmm. And when they raised the flag at Iwo and then took it back down, our men got it and gave it to Liver's Edge. And he displayed that in his home, in his family room for the rest of his life, the very flag that was raised on Iwo. So Howling Mad Smith, there's so many that were just, like you say, giants
Puller.
Of the time, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I got to know Chesty Puller's son, Lou, who terribly damaged. I mean, and it's, but the stories, and I talked to him about growing up with his father. Imagine your father's Chesty Puller.
I know.
He had these incredible stories about his old man, and I had him do a radio show with me, and the great line is everybody says goodnight to Chesty. And Lou Puller said, I still do.
Wow. The most decorated of all
Oh,
the Marines.
the
in
stories
history.
about him, and I've told this before, because of being so lucky to be able to do things like this and know people like you, but I met Joe Foss. I did a show with Pappy Boyington and Chesty's boy, and now I'm sitting here with you. So, and they
Well,
were so distinctly different guys, but they were who they were.
I am humbled that you would even
No, please. I mean,
mention my
because
name
yeah,
in
I
that.
know Carol.
These are men, like you say.
Well,
These are giants. These all of these
oh,
men were
I
giants
mean,
during this time,
yeah.
and thank the God above that
Oh,
He gave us men like this for such a time as this,
yeah.
as that was,
When
and
Pappy, I was doing an 8 to midnight show, and Pappy was here for an air show and making an appearance, paid appearance. And I went out of my way to get him. I had to have him on the show. I had to meet him. And he comes in the studio, and he's got like his, I don't know, maybe his fifth wife. I've never been sure. And back then on Friday nights, I would drink on the air. I mean, I didn't talk about it, but I was doing it. And I said, would you like a beer? And he said, honey. And she had a big flask in her purse. And the payoff on the story is I don't know, he was going to do an hour and ended up doing 4 hours because I was smart enough how to ask him the right things. And a guy called the show. This is a true story. I wish I had the tape. And he said, Pappy, same voice, and what? He said, where were you? Christmas Eve, 1944. And he said, I was in a POW camp, because he had been captured. And he said, I know. And Boyington said, how do you know? And the other voice said, I cut your hair that night.
oh my goodness,
Yeah, I mean, I still get chills.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
And remember they wrote on the roof, Boyington here.
yes.
Because and I would imagine our mall here, the 16th Street Mall, if I started down that mall and said, who was Howlin' Mad Smith? Who was Pappy? Who was Joe Foss? Who was Jimmy Roosevelt? Who was, you think we'd get an answer?
No, no, these are names that really should be honored more and more. It's just I'm doing as much as I can, my small part in trying to record these stories and get them down. You're talking about some of these names, but let me throw one out to you that was also just an incredible time, right in this time frame. But I had an uncle who one of his favorite sayings was, "There ain't no fake story ever as good as the real ones."
Yeah, that's
Okay,
true.
I always use that vernacular, and I grew up believing that, and that's one of the reasons I've spent my career interviewing people and writing their stories. That's basically all I've done as a magazine editor for many, many years, and then now with interviewing these men. But my uncle knew something about that because when he was 17, he joined the AVG, that's the American Volunteer Group, and he headed to China. This is pre-World War
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
II, just a few years before, and he was the chief mechanic for General
Wow.
Claire Lee Chennault, who
Chenault.
was the head and the founder of the Flying
Tigers.
Tiger.
Oh, yeah. And Boyington was a Tiger.
Yes,
Boyington,
yes,
and he wasn't fond of Claire Chenault, but the more he
yes, I
drank,
know.
the more, yeah, I mean, he talked about Chang and Chenault, and I said, when they went, as your uncle went, and I said, how did you go? He said, well, we had two choices, and I can't do his voice. He said, you could either be, I think it was petroleum sales or a missionary. And I said, who were you, Pappy? He said, I was a missionary.
Oh, yes, right. And you believe that, right?
I believe he did. I believe he went as a missionary
Yeah,
because they just wanted to go, and
yeah,
and
wanted to go.
when they shot down airplanes, they got paid.
Yes.
And when they
Well,
were,
when my uncle Jasper came back, he joined the Army Air Corps
yeah,
and spent a career, another 22, 23 years in the Air Force. So he absolutely loved the military. I guess I grew up in such a military family. My father was 22 years in the Navy. He was in the China Seas right prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And by the way, these guys never said Pearl Harbor. It was always just Pearl.
Pearl.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. What happened at Pearl, or when I was at Pearl,
Yeah.
And so I just grew up hearing the stories like you did, Peter. And they're priceless, such priceless stories.
How do you keep these things alive? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's some events that I've seen happen around me, and I think, well, this is going to get away. And I'm involved in another project, a friend of mine who had been murdered, and I said, this is going to get away. And I think, how many people are going to remember this or remember that? And when along you come and you write these things, and, my great fear as a little amateur history reader is this stuff gets away.
I know.
And
I'm doing all I tell you, I'm doing all that I
know
can
you
do,
are.
and I have friends that are also working in military history and trying to get these stories down. It's a little bit of a race against the clock in some ways,
Sure.
because so many of these men are passing away. When I started writing Marine Raiders, I had 3 of the 4 raiders that I feature in the book. 3 of them were living. I have personal interviews and have talked to them hours at a time, have met with them. I have their firsthand accounts of these. That's why I'm really so honored to have this book out now, is because we do have such personal accounts in it. When the book was going to press, 2 of those men passed away, but they knew that their story was going to be told, and I was so pleased about that. The 4th one passed away just a week and a half ago at 101 years old, Ed the Swede Blomberg. And he was just such a interesting man, almost 6'4", such a strong man. He was a lumberjack when he went in and was volunteered. You had to volunteer for the Raiders, but then you had to also really be chosen. You volunteered to be chosen. And so you had to go through a series of interview processes and so on and so forth. And Ed the Swede Blomberg passed with flying colors. So all 4 now are gone. But I'm just so proud that we were able to get their stories. The first one, the one that I was never able to interview, was killed in action on D-Day Guam, on the invasion of Guam. And his picture is on the cover of the book. He's the young man that's stretched out behind the machine gun, Lee Manier. There, you can see him down right there in the middle of the photograph. And there's a picture of him, and you can see all of those awards that he won as a rifleman. He was evidently really, really good marksman. And marksmanship was, of course, one of the things that the Raiders were so particularly known for. And Lee, this is so interesting, Lee had the most beautiful baritone voice. He sang in the choir, and on the troop trains going across the country, he met up with a few other young Marines, and they began harmonizing and crooning together. And as a result, they formed a singing group that we talk about in the book.
Yeah.
And they decided they were fooling around and trying to decide what to call themselves, and so they decided on the name, the Singing 8 Balls. And
8 Balls.
Yeah, to their kind of wonky sense of humor, an 8-ball, of course, in the military back then,
bad guy.
Screwball.
An oddball.
Was
An
really
oddball.
equivalent to a screwball. So they, to their kind of funky sense of humor, they thought that was hilarious to call themselves the Singing 8 Balls. But they began to sing together, and they entertained the troops. Now, this is before any USO, any of the shows came to the Pacific. Bob Hope didn't come until late 44, early 45 to entertain the men. But this really was the first entertainment that our troops in the South Pacific had. And we record the story, and this is so poignant. After one of the bloodiest engagements that Edson and 1st Raider Battalion were involved in fact, it's called Edson's Bloody Ridge. It was about a 36, 38-hour non-stop, mostly hand-to-hand combat. And after this, they were outnumbered 3-1, but it was a decisive victory for 1st Raider Battalion. They saved the day. Vandergrift told them that if the Japanese had broken through their lines, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal would have become another baton. And so after the battle, one of the men came to Lee Manier and asked him if he would sing for them. And he did. And we talk about, I have some letters from Lee to his family that they saved. So I know exactly what he sang. He sang, Nearer My God to Thee.
Yeah.
And he sang Old Man River. And he wrote home and he told his mother, he said, you need God out here.
Yeah.
And it's just a poignant scene when you see what they did. A fierce fighter, and yet the singing evidently, as one Raider said, and I have his quote, it took away the fear and the death for a little while, and we were at home again.
We'll play that on when we roll out of the of this piece that you were doing together, and we have the audio clip of it, the 8 balls, and we'll play it going out.
Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing too, and I grew up. I'm an old guy now, but you know, Jerry Jeff Walker, who we just lost, had that song "Desperados Waiting for a Train." That is one of my true favorite songs, and he says, you know, these are heroes of our country. And why are they all dressed up like these old men? And I don't think the society has a grasp. And today, they're, as you point out, they're gone. But they came home and they went back to work. And these guys built our country. They came out of the worst of the American Depression. They won. They beat the Japanese. They helped defeat the Nazis. They came home and they built a country. They began with everything again, went back to the car plants, the construction sites, went to college on the GI Bill, and they built the country only to have the craziness of the 60s come in. And I've sat and talked with many guys. They had no idea. What was this about? So how do you see them? And when they come home, when guys make it back, what did Ed do when Ed came home?
Ed, the first job he had was as a park ranger in Yosemite. And it actually turned out to be, as he told me himself, it was a blessing in disguise because he needed that
to be himself.
Away. Yes, he needed some time to himself. And as fortune would have it, he wound up being snowbound in a cabin way off in a remote area of Yosemite for about a week. And as he himself said, all he had was this, he had some food there as a park ranger, and he had his Bible. And that was it. No radio, not anything else. He was completely snowed in. And he began to really search his mind and his heart, because for Ed, one of the things that remained was this, and I have talked to other veterans, and there are a lot of men that come home from war and they have this question: why was I allowed to live? And my friends didn't come home. And Ed told me himself that during that week that he was snowbound in that cabin in the remote area in Yosemite with just his Bible, that the answer came to him. And he knew when he left that he wanted to spend his life working somewhere where people needed him, where he could be a missionary. And he spent 25 years in the rainforest in Belize, he and his wife. And they even wound up adopting 2 orphans, Belize orphans, and brought them back to the States and raised them. I've had the privilege of meeting both of those people. One was a little girl. She is now a very respected attorney in Washington, D.C. And the other one, a little boy, has now just retired from spending nearly 25 years in the Army, our Army. So, you know, it was a powerful story. And Ed found his answer to why was I allowed to live by his work that he did with these people, these orphans and these people in Belize for so many years.
There's a man that, again, lucky enough to have been around and spent time with by the name of Jake DeSazer. And DeSazer had been a Doolittle raider and was captured by the Japanese. They beheaded the officers. And he spent, I think, 3 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, which was brutal, learned to speak perfect Japanese. When it was over, he went back to Japan as a Christian missionary. I became friends with him. He's gone now. He's, but his name was Jake DeSazer. Yeah, real guy. Yeah.
Wow. That's a little like the Louis Zappernini story.
Favorite.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And let me tell you a little something though that I found out when I was researching for Marine Raiders. The Japanese for the Macon raid, Carlson's raid on Macon Island, actually a little atoll in the middle of the Pacific, just a coral outcropping was what Macon was. A lot of controversy when the raiders left that and went back out into the ocean to get on the submarines. A lot of storms, lots of riptides and currents. They had a horrible time. They were disorganized, had gotten separated, and they had to run silent. The submarines had to run silent all the way back to Pearl. And so they did not get to take a hard head count until they actually returned to Pearl Harbor. And when they did, they discovered the devastating news that they were missing 13 raiders and 12 or 13 raiders. And eventually, it was learned that 9 of them had been taken prisoner by the Japanese. And it turned out that Zamperini had actually been held in a cell, a concrete block cell, and he saw the names of those 9 Marines carved on the wall of that cell. So that's one of the things that we point to for that. But those 9 men were also beheaded later.
I know that you've got some new projects coming. I can't tell you how much respect I have for you. I mean, you're incredible.
Well, you humble me. You just humble me.
No. That's me and you. And we have just read the book, get it off of here. This is all Mark Crowley's work, and don't let it get away. And I know you got another one coming, and you're trying to make up your mind what to do. And I just have such respect. And we're going to play the song as we go out. It's the 8 Balls, and there's a group picture. It's the 4th Raider Battalion. Who are these people that we're going to see as we play this music?
Well, it's actually first. These were actually first Marine Raiders.
Oh, I apologize. I thought it was the 4th. I'm sorry.
No problem. You did.
Right.
Yeah, right. It's there's a lot going on here, but it's first Raider battalions, and so that was why they were at the very beginning of the war and could entertain those troops when they would come off the battlefield. But Lee Manier in this picture that you see right now is the one to the far right, the tall one on the far right, and evidently just had a great baritone voice.
Listen, you made the whole day happen. I'll carry this around in my head a long time. These shows have been, please, these shows have been, I get more out of it than you do. How's that? So.
I'll tell you, studying the lives of these warriors, they were just warriors of first rate of our country. And I am in talks with a couple of others right now. I will tell you that. And so just say a prayer that we get these stories pulled together. And they are amazing men in their late 90s, but I'm telling you, as bright and chipper. Chippy would be the right word, as they can be.
You take care of yourself. We'll see you again. There's the book, and we'll play this going out. Carole, you made my morning. You made the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Sure appreciate it. God bless.
I'll talk to you soon. All right, Marky, roll us out of this. Here we go.
We're the raiders from old Quantico, headed for Tokyo. We use special weapons to shoot up the town. Japs will be scattered around. We're headed for nowhere as far as they know, specially trained to fight. So don't get no notions and drink up your lotions. Come on and get into the fight. Get your gun, get your gun. We got Tojo sons on the run. Don't let them stop or they'll be back for more. And when they come back, we'll really get sore, 'cause they're saying goodbye to us all. As back to the Emperor they crawl. We'll take all their sake, they'll really go wacky. So line up your sights, make them fall.